Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Virtual Grand Canyon Star Party. I'm Ranger Raider Lane, the National Park Service coordinator for the event. And for 30 years running, Grand Canyon has been celebrating our pristine night skies through this annual Grand Canyon Star Party. Now, ordinarily, we invite hundreds of astronomers and thousands upon thousands of visitors to the park to enjoy 8 nights of some of the most pristine night skies in the United States. Each evening is kicked off with a special guest speaker in our theater, followed by telescope viewing, constellation tours, night sky photography workshops, and much, much more. Next year's Grand Canyon Star Party is June 5th through the 12th, 2021. So mark your calendars and fingers crossed that we'll be able to celebrate that on site next year. This year, however, we're bringing you a taste of Grand Canyon Star Party from in the virtual realm. We want to try to mirror how Grand Canyon Star Party sort of unfolds on site during any particular evening. So we're lucky to start each evening this year from June 13th through the 20th with one of our special guest speakers who are all been willing to share their talks with us online. We're excited to bring you some of the wonders of the summer sky into your homes with our virtual telescope viewing sessions that will premiere right after this program, so stay tuned for that. Before we introduce our special guest speaker this evening, I just have a couple of entities the National Park Service would like to thank for their support in this event. First, I want to thank the Grand Canyon Conservancy. Now, they're the park's official nonprofit partner, and they're doing all sorts of incredible things in the park right now. Some of their current priorities include trail restoration, the Desert View Intertribal Heritage Site, which is a project unfolding at the Watchtower, an amazing project. Stay tuned for details on that. They fund they fund research and education in the park, and of course, one of their top priorities is night sky preservation. So, through the generous support of Grand Canyon Conservancy and their supporters, Grand Canyon National Park was able to inventory over 5,000 lights in the park over the last few years, and we retrofit or changed out about 1,500 of those fixtures to be night sky friendly, with plans to retrofit a whole bunch more as the years go on. And this has enabled us to become certified as an international dark sky park in 2019. And this undoubtedly made us one of the largest, most highly visited, most complex international dark sky parks in the world. That very same year, in 2019, the park was awarded the distinction of International Dark Sky Place of the Year by the International Dark Sky Association. They're the nonprofit partner that certifies the parks and communities as international dark sky places, among a whole host of other tasks. In fact, the International Dark Sky Association's mission is to preserve and protect the nighttime environment and our heritage of dark skies through environmentally responsible outdoor lighting. We thank the International Dark Sky Association and their tremendous staff, and we hope they keep up all the great work. Finally, Grand Canyon Star Party and our designation as International Dark Sky Place of the Year could not have been achieved without the dedication, the passion, and the expertise of the Tucson Amateur Astronomy Association. They're our essential partner for hosting the Grand Canyon Star Party, and in our virtual Star Party session following this presentation, please thank the astronomers in the chat room. I mean, they're going to be populating the chat room, answering questions. They do this out of pure love of the night skies, and the National Park Service is really proud to work with them in this endeavor. And with that, I want to introduce tonight's special guest speaker. Tonight, we are very lucky to have Kevin Schindler with us. He is the historian at Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, where he has worked for more than 2 decades. Kevin is an active member of the Flagstaff History and Science communities, having served as sheriff of the Flagstaff Chorale of Westerners International for 13 years, and on the board of the Flagstaff Festival of Science for a similar length of time. When not digging through Lowell's archives, he writes articles for a variety of publications and contributes to the bi-weekly astronomy column Views from Mars Hill for the Arizona Daily Sun newspaper. He has written 6 books and has both a fossil crab and an asteroid named after him. He was recently named by Arizona Humanities as the recipient of the 2019 Friends of the Humanities Award, which recognizes public individuals who make lasting contributions to the cultural life of their Arizona communities through their active support of and involvement in promoting the humanities. Tonight, Kevin will present One Giant Leap, Apollo astronaut training in the Grand Canyon. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Hey, thanks, Raider. It's great to see you, as it were, and to talk about such a great topic. Congratulations on another successful year of the Grand Canyon Star Party. If it's a little bit different than in the past, I think it's still going to be a lot of fun for everybody. So let me get started here. This is really a labor of love for me because my background is in geology, and one of the best places in the world, not only for geology, but for hiking, for looking around the world, for just being, as it were, is the Grand Canyon. And then we think about the astronauts who went to the moon in the 1960s and early 70s. And that was one of the most dramatic accomplishments our country has ever pulled off. Something to really celebrate during times of trouble when the country was in a lot of ways falling apart. The Apollo program gave us something to rally around, and it was really an exciting time. So to be able to talk about that as we're a little bit past the 50th anniversary of the first landing, and to share about the Grand Canyon's legacy. There's so many parts of the Grand Canyon legacy, astronomy and space science is one. It's just a real pleasure for me. So let me pull my program up here. I'm going to show some pictures. And, for me, I've been working on this for a few years. And it's, like I said, it's a labor of love. My program is partly talking about the training that the astronauts did here in preparation to going to the moon, and partly kind of my story about trying to preserve this and the people involved with that, because it's such an important story. So let's just start out a little bit. We're going to talk about the astronaut training in the Grand Canyon. So why did the astronauts going to the moon go to the Grand Canyon of all the places in the world? Well, there's a story behind it, and I think it's important to give a little backdrop. So let me start with that, and then we'll talk about the canyon itself. If we go back to the late 1950s, October 4th, 1957, we are in the middle of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and at the height of this, they send up a rocket into space, and the first artificial satellite to go into orbit around Earth, called Sputnik. And this really got the attention of the American people and leadership, because the idea was, heck, if they can send a satellite up there, they can spy on us, they can drop bombs on us. We have to get caught up. We need to send our own satellites up there. So we started creating our own rockets that initially failed miserably, but we had to get caught up with the Russians. This was the mentality. And so the first American in space was Alan Shepard, but he wasn't the first person in space. The Russians got the first satellite on Sputnik. We followed with Explorer. We wanted to get the first person. Nope, it was Yuri Gagarin, Soviet. Alan Shepard was the first American, but again, second. So after Alan Shepard went up, he was up for a total of 15 minutes. And President John F. Kennedy, shown here at Rice University Stadium in Florida, or in Texas, he said to his cabinet, okay, the Russians keep beating us. They beat us in space. They beat us as the first person in space. How are we going to get caught up? And he was advised, I'll tell you how we're getting caught up. Let's make a challenge to go to the moon before the Russians get there. And so Kennedy jumped on this, and he declared before the decade was out that we were going to send people to the moon and return safely. So Alan Shepard flew to space in 1961. President Kennedy started telling Congress that he wanted to do this later that year. And in 1962, at Rice University, he made the famous speech where he said, we choose to go to the moon by the end of the decade. So we have 8 years and the clock is running. So we had to figure out how to get out there. We had to build the rockets. We had to get more astronauts to learn how to live in space and dock spacecraft and such. So there's a lot to figure out. Well, while this is happening, we have geologists, those pesky scientists here, and geologists such as Gene Shoemaker, who's shown on the right here. And Gene Shoemaker said, okay, we understand why we're going to the moon to beat the Russians. It's a political thing. But if we don't do science when we go there, that would be one of the most wasted opportunities we can ever imagine. If we're going to explore another world, we should really explore it, not just plant the flag and come back. We should collect rocks and learn about the place. And Gene Shoemaker said, we've got to do the science. And there were other scientists who were pushing this also. And he said, not only should we do the science, if we're going to do it, we've got to train the astronauts. Because the astronauts, here's the second group of astronauts that included Neil Armstrong in the upper left. Jim Lovell is the middle row, middle person, and some other future moonwalkers. These guys were test pilots. The second group of astronauts, they would be helping lead the way to the moon. And Shoemaker said, these guys, these are brilliant guys. They all have engineering degrees of some sort, but they're not geologists. We need to train them in geology so when they go to the moon, they know what rocks to pick up. They can look at the landscape and understand how it was formed. And so not only should we do science, we should prepare the astronauts to do science. We need to train them to become geologists. And he said, what better place than Northern Arizona? Now, you might think, if you know about the geology of the Grand Canyon, the geology of the Grand Canyon is nothing like that of the moon. The moon is volcanic rock. We knew this back in the 1960s. The Grand Canyon is layers of mostly sedimentary rock. So how would this help them get to the moon? Well, the geologists realized, and Gene Shoemaker and the other scientists realized, we want to train them in all sorts of geology. There are places around Northern Arizona, like Sunset Crater and Meteor Crater and other places we want to train them. But remember these astronauts, if we go back for a second, these guys are test pilots. They're interested in making the bird fly, beating the Russians. But what does picking up rocks have to do with that? We need to inspire these guys to want to do geology. And the scientists figured, okay, we'll teach them the geology at Meteor Crater and such, but let's start out with taking them to the Grand Canyon, because we need to inspire these guys to want to learn geology. If they're not inspired to do it, they're not going to want to do it. They're test pilots. A lot of them are a little skeptical about doing science. We need to inspire them. Just like millions of people through the years have been inspired by the Grand Canyon, let's do the same thing with the astronauts. So we'll take them there. We'll teach them how to read the story of rocks and look at rocks close up. And so the idea was to go to the south rim of the Grand Canyon. They'd start over at the South Kaibab trailhead, go down the South Kaibab, and on the way down, geologists, they would break up into small groups. One geologist per 3 or 4 astronauts, and one group would leave. After 10 minutes or so, another group would leave. Each group, with their own geologist, would hike down, stop at different sites, different rock layers, and the geologist would explain what they're looking at and how to read the rocks. They would go down to the bottom, stay at Phantom Ranch, and then hike up the next day along Bright Angel Trail. And as they're coming up, then they'll switch roles. The astronauts will explain what they're seeing and see what they remembered to the geologists. So in total, this would take essentially 2 days, a day to hike down, stay overnight, a day to hike back. And all the astronauts that went to the moon would do this except for one. And so there are 12 astronauts who walked on the moon, another 12 who flew around the moon. Every one of them, except for one, did this Grand Canyon training. The one who did not do the training, his name was Jack Schmitt. And Jack Schmitt was a trained geologist, the only geologist to go to the moon. So he didn't need to be inspired to learn geology. He already knew it. While the astronauts were in the Grand Canyon learning geology, the geologist was learning how to be a pilot. But all the other astronauts went down there to learn geology. And I should point out, this isn't the only place they learned geology. In Northern Arizona alone, they later would go to Meteor Crater and Sunset Crater and simulated crater fields in this area and down in Cottonwood. they would go to other places like New Mexico and California and Oregon and Hawaii and New Zealand and other places. But this was, Northern Arizona became one of the center points for the geology training because the U.S. Geological Survey became stationed here. And plus we have all these great natural resources. So the geologists started coming in 1964. The first group to come consisted of some of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, the ones that included Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom and so on. And it also included some of the next 9, that group of Neil Armstrong and others. It also included some of the other, a third class that included Buzz Aldrin. So the first group came up in March of 1964, and then later groups came up in June of that year, and then in 1966 another group came up. So the first place they all went to was the Yavapai Geology Museum at the South Rim. And sometimes they would be met by geologists. In this particular case, Eddie McKee, the fellow to the right, in the foreground to the right, he was a geologist and naturalist, a legend in the Grand Canyon. The McKee Amphitheater is named in his honor if you ever go up there. He was a legend for his knowledge of the Grand Canyon. So he or other geologists would meet the astronauts, give them an overview of what they would be doing, and then they would head to the trail and start hiking down. I'd like to show this picture here because in the front left, his profile, that's Alan Shepard, who a couple of years before this had become the first American to go into space. But this is also the only picture that I found of both Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, the first men to walk on the moon, the first humans to walk on the moon. This is the only picture I found of them training in Northern Arizona. And you don't see him very well. You see Buzz Aldrin just behind Eddie McKee. You can see at the left side of his face, if you look closely, you can see Aldrin on the name tag. And then on the far left, it almost looks like a ghost. There's Neil Armstrong. And he's got a hat on, which we'll see later on. So we know that's him. So this is where they would start the experience, then head to the trail and start hiking down. And this is where I want to start showing what I think are kind of fun, these then versus now pictures. As I told you, that's, part of this whole program and this effort is documenting what the astronauts did. And the other part of it is retracing it so that all of us can walk in the footsteps of the astronauts. Millions of people go to the Grand Canyon every year, and to be able to walk in the same spots of the astronauts who walked on the moon, I think is a special experience. So if we go back a little bit, here are the astronauts at the Yavapai Geology Museum, and 50 plus years later, this is what the Geology Museum looks like today. Still has a topo, a three-dimensional map there of the Grand Canyon and other information. So the astronauts then headed over to the South Kaibab Trail. And this is, again, the first group to go. It's March. In the background, you can see there's snow on the side of the Grand Canyon. This picture is kind of interesting because, again, this is 1964. So this is several years before the Apollo missions to the moon. But in this picture, we have Tom Stafford, who flew around the moon on Apollo 10. Jim Lovell, famous from Apollo 13 movie. John Young walked on the moon. Pete Conrad would walk on the moon. So this is a pretty impressive group. This is early on in their training, learning how to identify rocks and be geologists. And when you look at them, heck, they look like geologists. They have their geology hammers. Jim Lovell is holding a little case that has a notebook and holds maps because they're going to read geology maps to identify their location. John Young here has a big case that has a pouch for his notebook. He's got his water canister here, and the smaller case is for his compass, a Bronte compass, which geologists use to measure the strike and dip of rocks. Here's another picture. The one in the middle is Neil Armstrong. They have their hand lenses. If you're going to be a geologist, you're going to have a hand lens so you can look at minerals up close to identify them. Now on the moon, they wouldn't be holding a HoloLens like this because they have their space helmet on and everything. But the idea is for them to learn to be a geologist, to think like a geologist, and to act like a geologist. That means doing broad landscape overviews, describing what they see and making sense of what it means, looking at rocks up close, being able to identify what kind of rocks there are so they can collect these when they get to the moon. So they were very well prepared. I would say that in general they were quite well prepared, but it's still kind of funny to look at some of these. This is Scott Carpenter, who was one of the Mercury astronauts. And while they all have their backpacks and their geology hammers and all the other equipment, shoes weren't quite as well planned out. Scott Carpenter has white tennis shoes on here, which aren't ideal for going to the Grand Canyon. And I wouldn't recommend it to anybody, but these guys were in such excellent physical condition. While it might have hurt his feet, it didn't hurt his performance in the Grand Canyon. But overall, they were very well prepared. By the way, in the bottom, this is Neil Armstrong's kind of silhouette showing there. So they start hiking down. And if you're familiar with the Grand Canyon and the trails, you'll recognize a lot of these pictures. And what I'm going to do is show some of the pictures taken during the training. We have the most from the first trip. This is just like having kids. You have the most pictures of your oldest kid. If you have another kid, you have not as many pictures. If you have another kid, not as many pictures. By the last kid, there's hardly any pictures of them. It's the same thing with these trips. The first one in 1964, we have a lot of pictures. And the second one, not so many. The third one, we have hardly any. There just weren't as many photographers or media along as the first one. But here we are going down the South Kaibab Trail, some of the astronauts. And this is right before you get to Uaa Point or in that vicinity. And this is what it looks like today. Excuse me. And so during this research, one of my goals has been to not only tell the story, but to rephotograph as many of these places as possible. And that's where folks like Ranger and other rangers like Kate Pitts and Melissa and others have helped out to identify some of these locations. So this is what they saw, and it looks very similar to that today. Here's another spot. There are a couple of the Mercury astronauts, or there's Deke Slayton with the white hoodie, and Jim McDivitt, who is the second class astronaut. And I want to show this picture because it's interesting to see what doing research is like, historic research, because I was going down the trail and trying to figure out where the heck this was. You had these rocks that were pretty distinct in the background, and I soon realized that the picture had been inverted. And when I realized the picture was supposed to be this way, turns out I was standing right in front of it. So one of the perils of doing research is making sure your pictures are turned right and just having an open mind of what you're looking at. They headed down the trail, again, stopping along the way, collecting rocks, making observations. They stopped for lunch down at this fossil fern site that's still there today. It's at Cedar Ridge. If you go to Cedar Ridge, if you're hiking down, the restrooms are on the right. All the way to the left is this little stand, and this is a fossil fern exhibit. And on the left, here is Neil Armstrong. And next to him is Dick Gordon, who would fly around the moon on a later mission. When I went down there, this is what it looks like today with some kind of sketchy looking guy sitting next to the exhibit. But to me, this is what makes this so much fun, is we can retrace the steps. And just like we hike down the canyon, just any of us hike down there and get inspired, the astronauts did the same thing. And so for us to be able to follow in those footsteps and feel some of the same things they were feeling, I think is pretty interesting. One of the most distinct features in the Grand Canyon is O'Neill Butte. And this is what it looks like today. And another interesting thing that I found is comparing not just the people and where they went, but looking at some of the things that changed or didn't change. in looking at these pictures, I was looking to see how the rocks had changed over time and what might have fallen down and such. But then found kind of in the lower right, you see this kind of, maybe you can see this whitish linear thing kind of in an angle. And it shows up in the later picture. And that's a dead tree that is still there today. All those years later, half a decade or half a century later. Maybe not surprising in Arizona because wood can last for a long time, but it's still neat to see some of these things that are still in the exact same place centuries later. Near Skeleton Point, here's several of the astronauts looking at this little cavity, and this is what it looks like today in a color picture. Heading down the trail, there's a silhouette of Neil Armstrong, and you can see the peaks in the background. And here's essentially the same shot today. So we can really, because they photographed it well, we can really retrace it. Getting down to the Black Bridge, here's the tunnel heading into the Black Bridge and what it looks like today. And here's some of the astronauts going across the bridge, and again today. And I think to me, one of the most fascinating pictures is this one that shows Ed White to the left, who would later become the first American to walk in space, and Jim Lovell. And this picture was taken, again, 1964, right before the Glen Canyon Dam went in. When the dam did go in, it changed the water level, changed the ecology of the Colorado River. So if you look at this and see the level of the river and the color, it's not great in this picture, but you can see it's kind of a bluish brown, I guess. When we get to this, we can see the water level is much higher. It's very green because of all the algae living in there now, and the temperature changes and such. And so these pictures are great also, not just for documenting what the astronauts did, but for seeing how the canyon has changed over time. They got to the bottom after a long day. Some of the astronauts, like the first group here, stayed in cabins. And this is great. The Park Service staff has been so great in documenting all this. When I was at the bottom, we were trying to figure out where this was taken, what the cabin is. And there's a classic volunteer down at the Grand Canyon who's been there 30 years. His name is Shores. And we showed him this picture, and he said, "Oh, that's cabin 8 over by the cantina." And sure enough, here's Shores. It was cabin 8. We could tell by the rocks in the background. A lot of the vegetation and other things have changed, but the same area. For me, this was also kind of a personal experience because it reminded me of my first time in the Grand Canyon when I was in college. My first time, I was at the bottom in the middle of the night. I got woken up by a skunk. And in retracing what the astronauts did, I've been able to talk to several of them, like Fred Hayes and Neil Armstrong years ago, and Walt Cunningham, and Charlie Duke. And Charlie Duke, who walked on the moon on Apollo 12, remembered his first time hiking the canyon. He had a similar experience where a skunk crawled on top of his sleeping bag and woke him up. So I felt kind of a connection and also a fond memory of my first time in the Grand Canyon long ago of reliving that. And here's a picture of Charlie Duke minus the skunk. So they stay overnight. The next day, they switch roles. The astronauts are describing the geology as they come up. The trail went in a little different direction back then. It followed a slightly different path. There are some archaeological remains there that are protected, but at that time, because this was such an important program, the Rangers took the astronauts to see some of these sites. And this is a granary that's there. And thanks to the efforts of Rader and some of his colleagues, they gave me permission to revisit the site. And this is what it looks like today with my wife, Gretchen. And so, really hasn't changed too much. To me, one of the most satisfying things of retracing all this is, trying to figure out where these pictures are taken. And this one seemed like it was taken somewhere around Indian Garden, because we know they stopped there for lunch. Here's Neil Armstrong to the right with the red hat on, some of the other astronauts. And so I was down there a couple of times trying to figure out where this site was. And then Kate Pitts and Melissa Panter, two Rangers, we met last year and tried to find this picture. And we're walking around. I have this picture. My wife turns around and said, "Oh, I think I see the rock." And sure enough, there it is. If we go back, the rock in the upper left in this tree, when we went down there, it just happened to be after that tree was cut down because it was becoming a hazard and I think dying. And so this is right where that picnic table was. And if you ever hike the canyon, you know this spot because that's the big tree where you stop for shade, or used to stop for shade when you get to Indian Gardens. And here's Melissa on the left and Kate on the right. So again, there's something special, I think, to be able to not only understand the story, but retrace where these guys went. A couple final pictures. Gordon Cooper, here he is on a mule at Indian Garden. And if you notice in the background, that rock outcrop. The next picture, again, one of the most fun parts of doing this, we were down at Indian Garden. I'm trying to retrace or re-photograph the site. And the mule train happened to show up at that time. And we asked the mule driver, I showed her the picture and said, "Would you remind posing, because here's Gordon Cooper, the last American to fly in space alone. I want to recreate that." And so she hammed it up and gave us this great picture so we can document it that way. So they then hiked up to the top. Most of them rode mules up at the top, like Gordon Cooper, but some of them, like Alan Shepard, did not ride mules. They wanted to, their type A personality, they wanted to show how tough they were. And so they said, "I'm going to hike up and beat everybody." But those like Neil Armstrong, shown here, were content to ride the mules up. So what was the value of all this? This is a great adventure. Going to the Grand Canyon, for any of us who have been there, is an adventure, whether you hike down or just stand on the edge or go for a star party, which we hope to be doing next year. It's a great experience. And to think that those first people to walk on another world did some of their training here is such a special place, I think is really fascinating. And to be able to retrace their steps and kind of feel what they were feeling. Here's Neil Armstrong, 6 years before he was the first person to walk on the moon. He had no idea he was going to be first at this point, but you wonder what he's thinking. Just like so many of us sitting at the canyon, looking across, looking up, looking at the stars, looking at the rocks. We all have special thoughts going through our heads. And I think this picture captures that so well. So that's kind of a snapshot of the astronaut training here. In general, the astronauts found it very useful. Most, like Neil Armstrong and Alan Bean, both who walked on the moon, said going to the Grand Canyon is where they really got geology, where it really sunk in, that you can read rocks and understand your landscape by looking at them. Buzz Aldrin was really impressed with it. Of course, there are some astronauts who remain skeptical. One who said his greatest memory was winning a rock throwing contest. He and a couple of the astronauts were seeing who could throw a rock furthest in the Grand Canyon. But in general, they all found it a wonderful experience. And I think even those who, maybe they didn't even get, for those who didn't go to the moon or didn't land on the moon, it was still a time to learn about the universe around them, kind of in a localized area with the Grand Canyon. But it was still a pretty special experience. So for me, this is a great opportunity to be able to talk about the Grand Canyon, tie in the Grand Canyon Star Party with these heroes who went to the moon and were the eyes of geologists and people everywhere. And the stuff they did there was partly made possible by the training they did right here in northern Arizona at the Grand Canyon. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, and thank you very much.
All right. Well, excellent presentation as always, Kevin. Thank you so much for that. Tell us what are some things that the astronauts, when they went to the moon, I mean, what type of sort of specific geology were they doing? Were they just collecting rocks, or were they doing some other things that might have come from this training?
Well, the early missions, like Apollo 11, their job was to land, plant the flag, get back safely, and let's just collect some rocks. They had a couple hours for science, but not much. By the later missions, they were going really to do a lot of science. They spent a couple days up there, spent hours on the lunar surface. And so the science went from observing and collecting to, observing the landscape, collecting as many different types of rocks as possible, but also deploying scientific instruments, some of which are still operating today. Seismometers that would detect seismic activity. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set up a laser that, when pointed at the Earth, we could observe it and measure the exact distance between the Earth and Sun. So they not only, or the Earth and the Moon, so they not only did direct observation and collecting, but also deployed scientific instruments that continue to operate for years.
Excellent. And finally, what are some things that you and your staff are kind of doing over at Lowell Observatory down there in Flagstaff? I mean, what are some exciting projects you guys are working on?
Well, it's a really, it's an exciting time to be at Lowell. I mean, we're all dealing with the coronavirus and working in a different type of environment, a different kind of programming, but we're on the doorstep of a complete new era here because we have one of the world's most powerful telescopes for doing research, but we also have an outreach program that in the next 3 years is going to go from, I would say, pretty darn good to great to one of the best in the world. Because as our founder, Percival Lowell, said, it's great to do science, but what's the point of doing it if we don't share it with people and excite people about it? And so we're expanding our public program opportunities that will include a new visitor center 3 times the size of the current one. That'll include an open deck observatory where we're not going to have a planetarium, we're going to have the real thing because we have dark skies here, something that you helped make happen at the Grand Canyon and get the park's designation as dark sky site. We celebrate the dark skies in northern Arizona. And so that's something we're building into our new visitor center. So there's a lot of both great science and education going on.
Well, great. Well, thanks again, Kevin. And hopefully everybody can, make a trip to Lowell Observatory on your way to Grand Canyon or vice versa. It's just a fabulous institution and staffed with fabulous people, as you can see here with this presentation. So hopefully all of you watching will be able to attend next year's Grand Canyon Star Party, June 5th through the 12th, 2021. Kevin Schindler is a familiar face up there during that time. So hopefully you guys can come and meet Kevin in person and ask him all sorts of questions about the history of the Apollo missions at Grand Canyon and what Lowell Observatory is doing to expand our knowledge of the universe. So stay tuned after this program. Our virtual telescope viewing session is going to start very soon after this. And I hope you all will join us next year at the 2021 Grand Canyon Star Party. Meantime, thank you so much, Kevin. We really appreciate you, and hope to see you on site next year.
Great to see you. Thanks.